Chapter 1837, Part of Life. A few days later, Sunny dove into the cold waters of the Mirror Lake, while the full moon slowly climbed the lightless sky. It was the last full moon before the great war between the two domains set both worlds aflame, and therefore, the last chance he had to meet Cassie in the ruined stronghold of a dead demon. Infiltrating the true bastion unnoticed was still somewhat difficult. However, Sunny was tense for an entirely different reason. Rain, that girl is really committed to making my life overly exciting, isn't she? It was shortly before his sister expressed her determination to participate in the domain war on the side of Queen Song. Which wasn't really a big surprise to Sunny, who knew Rain well enough to guess that she would not stay idle. She was too compassionate and not nearly jaded enough to let her neighbors be bullied without trying to do something about it, no matter how small her contribution would be in the grand scheme of things. So, he wasn't that angry. In fact, he was happy to see that she still retained this kind of innocence. He was also a little proud to know that she had this kind of integrity, something that he had always lacked, and only barely found in Antarctica before losing it all over again. But still, what brother wanted to see his little sister put herself in danger? Honestly, Sunny wanted nothing more than to whisk her to the nameless temple and keep her under lock until everything was over. No, the nameless temple wasn't safe enough, considering what role it was supposed to play. Nowhere was really safe anymore, and nothing would be really over for a long while. However, the main reason Sunny had not tried to dissuade Rain from joining the war was that she had to make her own choices, earn her own triumphs, and suffer from her own mistakes in order to learn and grow. No matter how much he worried about her safety, he would never want to become someone who stifled her growth with overbearing care instead of aiding it. That would only be a disservice, especially for someone as bright and dauntless as Rain was. Plus, so what if she was going to war? It would be a little tricky, without a doubt, but Sunny was quite confident in his ability to keep her alive even in the middle of a battlefield. Who was there among the champions of song and valor whom he couldn't handle? Well, all right, there were the sovereigns, but he could at least run away from them safely. So this war could very well become a harsh, but indispensable opportunity for her to mature and grow stronger, both in terms of ability and mentality. It was the latter part that Sunny was worried about, not because he thought that Rain couldn't handle it, but because he knew that she would be left with invisible scars even if she did. Scars were a part of life as well, though. They were a part of growth. I don't know. In any case, there was nothing he could do about it now. So, Sunny tried to forget his worries and concentrate on the task at hand. Cassie was waiting for him near the collapsed tower, her beautiful hair glistening in moonlight like pale gold. She was in one piece and seemingly alive. There were no visible bruises anywhere either. So, Sunny felt a little less guilty about exposing her to Neff's wrath. I'll make it up to her later somehow. Rising from the water, he climbed onto the remains of the fallen tower. Hey, Cassie. Cassie smiled faintly. Hey, Sunny. It was still strange and heartwarming to hear someone call him by his name. Sunny enjoyed the feeling and looked at the crumbling walls of the ruined fortress. They seemed even more deserted than before. He raised an eyebrow. I don't see any knights on the walls. She nodded. There was no call for the vassals to assemble their armies yet, but the royal clan has already started to move its forces. Most of the knights and paladins are heading north. Awakened soldiers, too. It is hard to notice on the streets of the false bastion, but here, their absence can be felt. Cassie hesitated for a few moments. The king is still here, though, so we need to be careful. He offered her his hand without wasting any time, then pulled them both into the mirror maze. Once they were in the familiar stone chamber, Sunny let go of Cassie's hand, summoned the shadow lantern and said, I am glad that you are okay, and I'm sorry for putting you in a difficult situation. Well, I am sure that Nephis was her usual composed and restrained self. But still, the two of you must have had a heated conversation. Cassie faced him, and for a moment there was a strange expression on her face. Oh yes, indeed, she was her usual composed self. With that she turned to the door and smiled. It's all right. I was actually glad to see her a little flustered. You did a fine job, by the way, telling her. Now that this obstacle is behind the two of you, the future seems a little brighter. Sunny sighed quietly. I hope so too. But to tell you the truth, I am as worried and apprehensive about it as I am relieved and elated. There are things I simply can't tell her after all. Can we really be together when we can't even be honest with each other? I am worried. Cassie smiled. Of course you can. Honesty is important, but it is also overrated. If people were entirely honest with each other, there would have been no romance in the world. What do you think a relationship is? At the start, everyone hides their true selves and only shows the other person their best side. And by the time two people come together, even if some details remain hidden, the important truths shine through. I think you showed her the important truth splendidly. Sunny stared at her silently for a while. It was strange, but after hearing her words, he suddenly felt a lot better. Sensing his reaction, Cassie raised an eyebrow. What? He shook his head. Nothing really. It's just that, how are you so good at giving advice? You've never been in a relationship before yourself. It's weird. Cassie seemed mortified. Who said that I've never? Sunny gave her a dubious look. Please. The young woman remained motionless for a few moments, then slowly turned her back to him. Her voice sounded a little irked. Unbelievable, that's 2 times in a week now. Soon, a tide of shadows swallowed the mirror maze, and they continued their meticulous exploration. Sunny did not really hope to reveal the secret of the maze tonight. In fact, by now, he was starting to suspect that he would never be able to reach its heart that way, simply because what he was doing was inherently wrong. It was impossible to reach the tomb of Ariel no matter how long one marched across the nightmare desert, at least during the day. He believed that the only way to approach the Great Pyramid was to brave the Sea of Dunes at night, when it was the most dangerous. Similarly, there must have been some trick to traversing the labyrinth of mirrors, perhaps by drowning the maze in shadows and neutering its mirror walls. Sunny was preventing himself from making any progress. He sighed. Behind him, Cassie hesitated for a few moments, and then said quietly, That girl in the song domain. Sunny glanced back with a neutral expression, knowing what she wanted but couldn't ask. She is someone precious. The blind seer remained silent for a while. Eventually, she smiled and said with a hint of wonder in her voice, It is funny, isn't it? The entire world is frozen in fear and anticipation of a great war that will shape history. And yet, no one is aware that something no less important has happened in the desolate wilderness of the dream realm, witnessed by nobody except for a young legacy girl, you and me, a human of the waking world awakening without being cursed by the nightmare spell. Your achievement is remarkable. A pale smile appeared on Sunny's lips as well. Funny, it is a bit funny, I guess. He remained silent for a few moments, and then added, However, this achievement can only become important in the future. She can only make a difference in the future. Right now, it is up to people like us, you, me, and Nephis, to make sure that there is a future for people like her to make history. His smile turned a little bittersweet. In fact, if there is a future, I hope that what we did becomes all but forgotten, and only what they did is remembered. Such a wish is quite ironic coming from someone like me, isn't it? Cassie chuckled. It is, especially when expressed to someone like me. Although I must say I doubt that there is someone like you or me out there, or will ever be again. Sonny couldn't help but laugh quietly. Gods, I hope not. It would be quite sad if someone in the future had to suffer like him, and was forced to do the same terrible things that he had done or was yet to do still. Just then, they made another turn and froze. His eyes widened. I'll be damned. Sonny had not expected to discover anything in the mirror maze tonight, but unexpectedly, he did. Out there in front of them, the narrow corridor opened into a vast hall. The mirror walls that had been pressing down on them expanded, disappearing into the distance. The floor of the underground chamber was sloping downward like a bowl, and the ceiling was out of sight. The spherical hall was so vast that Sonny could not see the other end of it. In fact, he couldn't see anything, as if something was obscuring his vision. His shadow sense was similarly suppressed. All he could feel was that the hall was enormous, ancient, and dangerous. Sonny's instincts were screaming that he needed to retreat. This sense of dire danger reminded him of the worst horrors he had experienced in his life. Then there was a sound in the darkness. Chilled to the bone, Sonny looked down and felt something that did not make any sense, and yet filled him with a sense of terror. A wave of cold water rolled over the floor and licked his boots, pieces of ice drifting in the foam, then receded, as if he was standing on the shore of a freezing ocean. Then there was another sound, the rustle of countless leaves and the creaking of enormous branches. Wisps of mist drifted in the darkness, brushing against his skin like cold tendrils. The ghastly smell of the outskirts assaulted his nose. Before anything happened, Sonny grabbed Cassie and pulled her back into the corridor. Then, feeling that it was not enough, he stepped through the shadows and brought them back to the stone chamber. Letting go of the blind seer, he leaned on the wall heavily. His vision returned. Both of them were deathly pale and trembling. What the hell was that? Cassie's voice was subdued. Sonny forced himself to calm down and let out a stifled laugh. It wasn't easy to scare two saints, and yet here they were. The demon of imagination, damn. Cassie raised her eyebrow. What do you mean? Sonny slowly straightened his back and brushed his hair back. This castle was created by the demon of imagination once, wasn't it? So there have to be traces of her power left here. The mirrors are one such relic. The hall we found, I think it is another. The blind seer frowned. The icy water, the rustle of countless leaves, the mist, what do they have to do with the demon of imagination? Sonny slowly shook his head. Nothing, but when we entered the hall, I felt a sense of danger and couldn't help but remember some of the most harrowing encounters of my life. And so, he hesitated for a few moments, struggling to believe in the theory that had formed in his mind. Eventually, though, Sonny finished his thought in a low tone. And so, the hall made them real. Cassie's face paled. You mean to say that that place can make what we fear into reality? Sonny lingered for a while, then shook his head again. No, if I am right, then it is not what we fear. He shivered, and then added in a somber tone. It's what we imagine. Come to think of it, he must have gone blind there because of Cassie. Damned demons. Why did every one of them have to be scarier than the next? Cassie seemed a little shocked by his suggestion, too. She hesitated for a while, then asked in a small voice. Then do you want to go try again? There is still time before dawn. Sonny laughed. Are you crazy? Just think about what is hidden there in our heads. Let's not even mention that one of us might accidentally think about having their limbs severed or skin peeled off. Can you control your thoughts completely? What if you imagine that cursed tyrant, condemnation? What if you think about the forgotten God? He took a deep breath. I knew that there would be some kind of challenge at the heart of the mirror maze, but this is beyond what I have imagined, pun intended. Conquering that hall is a lethal task even for us. No, especially for us. Because we have seen too much and remember too much. It definitely wasn't something that could be accomplished in a day. If he wanted to reach the heart of the Hall of Imagination, he would need to prepare thoroughly. Sadly, there was no time. Sonny looked at the door of the stone chamber with regret, and then sighed. It doesn't matter. I had a small hope of finding what I seek here before the war, but I can find it after we win, too. By then, there will be no king of swords and no clan valor. I won't need to hide in the darkness and come here only once a month, so I will return to this eerie place then. With that, Sonny offered Cassie his hand and forced out a smile. Let's leave for now. There is a lot I have to do in these next few days. It was true because these would be the last days of peace. Pale sunshine poured through the open window, and a gentle breeze made the curtains flutter. Sonny opened his eyes slowly, laying comfortably in his opulent bed. The subtle sounds of the city waking up washed over him, bright and lively on this peaceful morning. He yawned, then slowly got up. Today was like any other day in Bastion. There were some changes about the mood on the streets of the young city as of late, but mostly it was the same. The brilliant emporium was also the same, except for one detail. There was a hand-drawn sign standing in front of the entrance. It had been there for the past few days, attracting plenty of attention. The sign said, "Closing soon. Temporarily. Farewell discounts for everyone. Best waffles in 2 worlds." As a result, Sonny had earned quite a lot of coins in the last day or two. The brilliant emporium seemed to have gathered a loyal audience, and the regulars were both sad to see it temporarily close doors and in a hurry to visit it one last time. But today was the last day. So Sonny wanted to make it perfect. Reaching the kitchen, he was surprised to see that Aiko was already there. The petite girl usually liked to sleep a lot. If it wasn't for the job, she would have lazed around in bed until noon. But today, she was there before Sonny. He looked at her in surprise. "I'm not seeing things, am I?" She grinned. "Of course not, boss. What are you talking about? I have always been dependable, punctual, and diligent." Sonny looked at her with doubt. Dependable, punctual, and diligent. Do you even know what these words mean? Aiko nodded energetically. "Of course, boss." He stared at her some more, then sighed. "Well, whatever. Start preparing the ingredients." The petite girl made a fist and floated up a little. "Yes, boss, I love you, boss." He shuddered. Aiko had been like that after realizing how profitable a war could be to an establishment dealing with memories. Her eyes had not stopped sparkling since. Sonny could practically see all kinds of nefarious schemes forming in her twisted little head. At least someone is happy. He manifested an avatar and went about welcoming the first customers. A few familiar faces visited the brilliant emporium that day. Early in the morning, he guided Bate to her usual table and brewed her some coffee. The dark circles under the young woman's eyes were even more pronounced than usual, and she seemed to be partially asleep. Sonny was a little touched that she made time to visit the brilliant emporium on its closing day despite that. "Here's your coffee, Miss Bate. Thank you for coming to say goodbye." She stared at him tiredly, then blinked a couple of times. Goodbye." Sonny hesitated for a moment. "Yes, we are closing today temporarily." Bate frowned. "Oh, really? I didn't know. I haven't left the lab in a week, you know. Wait, what day is it today? In 10 days. Sonny looked at her silently, not knowing what to say. His pleasant smile froze a little. She sighed. "Well, it's a shame. I really grew to like this place. Good luck to you, Master Sunless, in whatever it is that you are going to do next." His smile widened a little. "Good luck to you as well, Miss Bate. I really hope that you succeed. But please take care of yourself. Your life is precious, too." She sipped her coffee and smiled with a hint of bittersweet sadness in her eyes. I know. After all, there was someone who paid a great price to save it, so I have to live well. Shortly after, Sonny served teacher Julius breakfast and tea. The old man seemed strangely down, looking in the window with a distracted look. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then asked politely, "Is something bothering you?" awakened Julius. The old man perked up a little. "Ah, Master Sunless, it's nothing much. I'm just feeling old these days. I was born before there was even such a thing as the nightmare spell, you know. A youngster like you might not understand." He looked in the window and sighed. "The world keeps changing, and old fossils like me can't keep up. Maybe it's time for me to retire." Sonny sat down across from him and chuckled. "What are you talking about?" awakened Julius. "You, of all people, must not retire." Teacher Julius raised an eyebrow. "Oh, why, right. You probably don't know, but my course has never been very popular. I am usually lucky to get 1 or 2 students to attend. They are always the best students at the academy, of course, but still. It's a bit." Sonny shook his head. "It is because the world is changing that you must never retire. Think about it. Wilderness survival might not have been very in demand before, but it was only useful to a handful of awakened before as well." He gestured to the quiet street outside. "Now there are many more awakened out there. There are mundane people living in the dream realm too. There are roads being built between new cities and trade routes being established. We are not just surviving in the wilderness anymore, we are trying to conquer it. So, experts like you will become more precious than gold very soon." Teacher Julius stared at him with a strange expression for a while. Then his eyes glistened. "You think so?" Sonny nodded. "Of course." The old man was suddenly full of energy and smiled. "No, but you are right. The development of civilization is like a conquest of the wilds. Now that civilization is developing in the dream realm, youngsters like you will need someone with a bit of sense to guide them. I might not have a lot of sense, but I do know a thing or two about the dream realm. Let's see. I just need to change my approach a little." It was the same infectious enthusiasm Sonny was familiar with. Smiling, he quietly left teacher Julius to contemplate and left to serve other customers. At some point, Kim and Luster entered the dining hall. They seemed a little disheartened to see the brilliant emporium closing its doors. Luster shook Sonny's hand and gripped his shoulder with a strangely emotional look on his face. "I think I know why you have no choice but to do it, Master Sunless. Those damned rumors." The young man's eyes were almost glistening with tears. "But for whatever it is worth, I want you to know that for me and many others like me, you are a hero. A true hero, Princess Nephai's dam. I admire you so much, Master Sunless. Please teach me your ways." Kim silently grabbed him by the collar, pulled him back, and gave Sonny an apologetic look. "Please ignore my idiot husband, Master Sunless." Luster looked at her, hid a smile, and grumbled. "No, I'm just saying, can't I admire a virtuoso? It's purely academic interest." Sonny coughed, then guided them to a table. As they were sitting down, Luster looked around and asked in confusion, "By the way, Kimmy, where's Quentin?" She shrugged. "He was walking bait home, so it will probably be just us two today." Feeling something stir a little in his heart, Sonny smiled with genuine mirth and walked away to help prepare their food. He put extra effort to make sure that these two enjoyed an unforgettable meal. Later, Sonny heard soft whimpers coming from outside. Opening the door, he saw a peculiar scene. Aiko, who had left some time ago to run an errand, was floating in the air with a panicked expression. Little Ling was hugging her leg tightly, hanging on it like a monkey. Huge tears were falling from the little boy's eyes. "No, Auntie Aiko can't leave. Ling Ling won't let her go." Giving up in despair, Aiko stopped trying to float away and awkwardly patted him on the head. It's all right, puppy, I'm not leaving yet, but if you don't let go, I won't be able to walk. Ouch, my leg. Ling's dad finally managed to pull his son off her, hugged him tightly, and gave Sunny a helpless smile. Sorry about that. Nevertheless, little Ling's tears were dried up soon. The boy was fully preoccupied with a bowl of ice cream, but he still insisted on holding Aiko's hand and refusing to let her out of his sight even for a minute. His father sighed. Are you really leaving? Sunny glanced at him, then smiled. Yes, well, for a while. Hopefully we'll be back one day. Little Ling's dad looked a little sad. The two of them were on friendly terms and spent quite a bit of time together due to the cooperation between the Beast Farm and the Brilliant Emporium. Sunny felt a bit touched to know that he would be missed. In the meantime, please take care of your family. Most people do not know, but you should be aware that we are in for some tough times. His former soldier nodded somberly. I know, I will. You take care too, Master Sunless. Sunny gripped his shoulder for a moment, then went over to the table and patted Ling Ling on the head. The little boy looked up at him and smiled shyly. Uncle. Sunny smiled as well. I'm sorry, Ling Ling. This is the last bowl of ice cream I'll be able to treat you with for a while. Little Ling's tiny face instantly turned downcast. His doleful expression was both incredibly cute and comical. I see. Sunny sighed. But when I return, I'll give you 3 entire bowls of ice cream, and a huge mug of hot chocolate, and even a cake. The little boy's eyes widened. Really? Sunny nodded. Of course. In the meantime, take care of your mom. She looks tough, but she is actually a huge softie. You need to treat her well. Little Ling grinned. Ling Ling treats mommy the best. Then he giggled and added with excitement. Mommy is huge, Uncle said so. Sunny's expression faltered. No, wait a second, don't say that. Most importantly, don't say that I said that. Not huge, a huge softie. Repeat after me, Ling Ling. Softie, softie. But the little boy was already distracted by something else and refused to listen. Looking at him, Sunny paled a little and then sighed. Maybe it's a good thing that I am leaving Bastion. I need to get the hell out of here before Effie hears that. There were more customers after that as well. A lot of female customers, in particular, were sighing as they threw secretive glances at Sunny. He was even worried that there was something wrong with his cooking today, but Aiko simply rolled her eyes and assured him that everything was fine. Sunny could only carry on in bewilderment. I guess people get really attached to their favorite cafes. But then, eventually, it was time to close the doors. It was already dark by then, and the young moon was slowly rising in the sky. Sunny remained on the porch for a while, looking at the city and breathing deeply. He had grown used to the scent of Bastion in the past year, without even knowing that he had. In hindsight, it had been a wonderful year. But now it was time to leave. He sighed. I'm going to miss this. With that, Sunny turned around, walked inside, and closed the door behind him. High in the sky above Bastion, a beautiful island was hovering, shrouded in the veil of clouds. Illuminated by pale starlight, a white pagoda stood upon it, piercing the heaven. Nobody noticed when the flying island started to move. Not only because it was dark, and most of the citizens were already asleep, but also because a perfect illusory copy of the island remained in its place when it did. Due to the attempted assassination of Changing Star, Clan Valor gained leverage over the government. They used some of that leverage to summon Saint Thane, a government transcendent who held power over dreams and illusions, to Bastion. His task was to hide the fact that the Ivory Island had left the sky above Mirror Lake. In truth, it was heading for Godgrave. Before that, however, the flying island made a stop. Descending from the great heights, it reached the shore of the lake and landed on the water. A tall wave rose, flooding a few streets that were closest to the shore for a few moments. Among them was a quiet street where a cozy brick cottage stood. At that moment, something bizarre happened. The cottage stirred and then rose, revealing countless metal legs that were attached to its bottom. Turning around, it trotted to the shore and then nonchalantly dove into the water. The cottage swam surprisingly well for a brick building. Covering the distance to the island swiftly, it climbed ashore, shook energetically, and then looked around in confusion. It was as if it was unsure where to plop down. Eventually, the bizarre creature simply lowered itself to the ground where it stood. As soon as it did, the island slowly rose from the water and moved north. Soaring into the sky to hide behind the clouds, it flew above the sleeping city and left it behind. At that time, the door of the cottage opened, and a young man with alabaster skin and raven-black hair walked out of it. Sunny stepped on the soft soil of the ivory island, inhaled deeply, and smiled. What a beautiful sight! Nephi's was standing a few steps away, looking at him calmly. She responded to his smile with one of her own. Ivory Island is indeed beautiful at night. Welcome. He looked at her silently for a while, then shook his head softly. I wasn't talking about the island. Neff's eyes widened a little. Oh. She hesitated for a few moments, then looked away in embarrassment and gestured to the dark expanse of emerald grass. Would you like to take a walk? Sunny nodded with a smile. Sure. He offered her his arm, and when she took it, asked quietly, Once we reach Godgrave, where do you want to go? I'm afraid there are no beaches there, but I can still prepare a picnic. Nephi's chuckled. We won't reach it for a while. There's plenty of time to decide. They walked silently side by side, eventually reaching the edge of the island. Below, a sea of clouds was shining with reflected starlight. Above, a myriad of stars was burning in the distant sky. Neff's eyes were like two radiant stars as well, but much more beautiful. She studied the night sky for a while, then sighed. I find myself in doubt now that we are leaving for war. It happens sometimes, albeit rarely, and I can't really reveal that side of myself to anyone because my strength is their strength. But I am afraid sometimes, too. Can we really win? Can we really defeat the sovereigns? Even if we do, what then? A fragile smile appeared on her lips. Of course, I always banish these doubts since I can't afford them. You just caught me before I could steel myself tonight. Sunny looked at her silently for a while. Eventually, he smiled. Of course we can win. Of course we will defeat the sovereigns and everything that comes after them. Nephi's faced him, her ivory face bathed in starlight. Why are you so sure? Sunny chuckled. When he spoke, his voice was calm and confident. Because that is our will. Who dares to stop us? She was standing so close that he could hear her heartbeat, and his own. The stars were shining in the lightless sky, illuminating the world with soft radiance. In that radiance, her lips looked even softer. Only war awaited them ahead. Placing his hands on her shoulders, he gently pulled her in and leaned forward. His heart was beating like a caged beast. When their lips touched gently, it was as though the whole world was engulfed with heat. And Sunny wasn't satisfied with that gentle touch. He was hungry for more. Wrapping his hands around her, he pulled her closer until their bodies were pressed tightly against each other, with no space for anything except passion between them. Nephi slowly raised her hands and embraced him, as well, responding to his kiss. At the same time, their kiss grew more passionate, as if both had been starving for each other's lips for a long, long time. And intoxicated by the taste of her, Sunny finally felt complete. Somewhere else, a ruined fortress bathed in the light of a shattered moon. In the remnants of its main keep, a tall dais stood. There was no throne and no altar on the dais. Instead, there was an iron anvil and a man who stood in front of it, swinging a heavy hammer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a lean but mighty physique. Powerful muscles rolled under his glistening skin, and his sweat was evaporating in the unbearable heat of a crucible. His bare torso was painted in shades of vermilion by its angry light. The man had dark hair and a thick but dignified beard. The expression on his noble face was harsh and austere, and his gray eyes were as cold as tempered steel. There was a sword taking shape under his hammer on the iron anvil. Eventually, the man put the hammer aside and quenched the incandescent blade in water. The reflection on its surface convulsed when it was pierced by the sharp tip, and was then obscured by rising steam. A few moments later, the blacksmith pulled the sword out of the water and looked at it closely. Then the intensity of his gaze was replaced with contempt and disappointment. Gritting his teeth, the man tossed the beautiful blade aside. It fell from the dais and flew down. What waited below was a mountain of swords, each so masterfully crafted that many warriors would eagerly kill for the right to wield one. The newborn blade landed on the top of the mountain and joined its countless siblings, laying there, abandoned and forgotten. Far away, a vast hall cut in blue ice was drowning in darkness. In the center of the hall, a tall throne stood, illuminated by the ghostly light of dancing flames. A corpse of a breathtakingly beautiful woman was sitting on the throne, dressed in a regal red gown. Its hem spilled down the steps of the throne like a river of blood. The woman's chest was pierced by a sword, which pinned her to the back of the throne. Two dead youths stood on both sides of the throne, waiting in silence. Then the silence was broken. Pieces of ice fell to the floor and shattered as the dead woman's hand slowly rose. Her pale, long fingers wrapped themselves around the blade of the sword. Soon there was the sound of metal breaking. In the next moment the ice hall, and the entire mountain encompassing it, shuddered. And someplace else, a gaunt man was sitting in the dust, wearing a tattered spacesuit. The visor of his helmet was cracked, and the oxygen in the tank attached to his back had long run out. Nevertheless, the gaunt man was somehow still alive. He had been motionless for a while, but now he finally moved. Raising his head, he looked at a beautiful blue disk floating in the great darkness above him. His cracked lips twisted into a smile. How curious. That was what he wanted to say. But of course, no sound escaped from his lips, since there was no air to transmit it. The man tried to sigh, but failed for the same reason. He shook his head in dejection and moved his lips again. If someone was there to read them, they would have read. It's starting. The war for the throne of humanity had begun. End of Volume 8, Lord of Shadows. Sunny was standing on the edge of the ivory island, looking at the sky above. The marvelous mimic was behind him, still pretending to be a quaint brick cottage. The cottage stood between the grove and the lake, on the empty stretch of emerald grass to the side of the great pagoda. The area was quite peaceful, and the view from his window was usually no less spectacular than it had been in Bastion. Of course, that peacefulness was deceiving. The ivory island was high in the air. Far below it, the arm of the dead god lay heavily on the ashen ground. A long bridge was connecting the Humerus and the Radius, which had broken off eons ago. The bridge had been recently built, and currently a vast column of warriors was marching across it, ready to enter Godgrave. A sea of vermilion banners fluttered above like blood. The sight of the great army of the Sword Domain was quite daunting. There were hundreds of thousands of awakened, numerous masters, and dozens of exalted saints. Such a force had never been gathered in the history of humankind, or of the waking world at least. There were countless mundane humans, too, following the warriors in the vast train of the army. Funnily enough, this great force had not been assembled to fight against nightmare creatures or other horrors of the dream realm. It had been assembled to wage war against a similar human army that was currently somewhere far away, on the other side of the titanic skeleton, scaling its right arm. In any case, Sonny was not looking down on the sword army. Instead, he was looking at the sky. The sky had been blue and clear not too long ago, but now it was being slowly devoured by gray clouds. They were finally crossing the realm boundary. Soon, an annihilating white radiance would suffuse the incandescent heavens and spell fiery doom for anyone caught directly in its light. He sighed. It did not feel safe at all to be invading Godgrave atop a flying island. No matter how powerful its enchantments were, the ivory island was enormous and immensely heavy. Due to inertia, it would not be able to stop instantly should the veil of clouds break, which meant that all of them would become ash. What a way to start a war! Technically, the war had already begun. The official declaration had happened soon after the Ivory Island left Bastion, almost a month ago. Back then, Nephi's and Cassie had been summoned to the waking world. Sonny had been invited as well, albeit as the Lord of Shadows, not the memory purveyor of the Fire Keepers. There was a historic meeting in the stronghold of Clan Valor in NQSC. All the saints of the Sword Domain were present, as well as the heads of those vassal clans that did not possess a transcendent member at the moment. What made it historic, though, was not the illustrious company. It was the fact that the King of Swords himself attended. Sonny was quite shocked when the doors opened, and a heavy presence suddenly settled in the opulent hall, forcing even the most powerful saints to grow stiff and quiet. Of course, his face was hidden behind Weaver's mask, so no one was the wiser. They were seated around a vast round table, which, it seemed, had been carved from the trunk of a single enormous tree. The table held some significance. Without a doubt, perhaps it was that tree in particular that had been the source of the abominable forest slain by Anvil of Valor in the past. In any case, there was an empty seat next to Morgan. Sonny guessed that, maybe, it had been left empty in honor of Saint Maddock, her uncle, but he was proven wrong. As the vast presence enveloped the hall, there was the sound of heavy steps, and a tall man in dark armor entered, a vermilion cloak draped around his shoulders. The man was naturally imposing in a way that made others cower. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a mighty build. His eyes were gray and cold like tempered steel, their gaze oppressive enough to make one shudder. His hair was black, and a full beard obscured the lower part of his austere face. Despite that, it was impossible to miss how noble and distinguished it was. The man was supposed to be close to 50, but did not look a day older than 30. However, the most striking thing about him was not his height, his build, and his cold gray eyes. It was not even the oppressive force of his unfathomable, boundless presence. It was something invisible and intangible, an otherworldly quality that forced one to look at him, pay attention to him, and want to kneel in front of him. This was Anvil, the King of Swords. Sonny had only seen him once before, from afar. He was still unsure what barriers there were that prevented the sovereigns from visiting the waking world often, and what was the cost of breaking them. All he knew was that, today, the king had decided to descend into the mortal world. The rest of the meeting was like a blur. Anvil did not waste a lot of time, speaking in a calm and concise manner, as if the very concept of wasting words was offensive to him. It did not seem like he was trying to explain something to the gathered powerhouses or wish to persuade them. Instead, he was simply stating his will. His message was clear. The rulers of the Song Domain had conspired to kill his daughter, and therefore to harm the Sword Domain. Therefore, he would assemble an army to march on Ravenheart and tear down Kai Song's throne. And those present as his vassals would become that army. Sonny was so caught up in the solemn atmosphere, and the irresistible authority hiding in Anvil's deep voice that he almost missed how ironic the whole thing was. After all, there was the Han Li clan somewhere out there still. That was the clan from which Castor, who had been sent to the Forgotten Shore to kill Nephi's, hailed from. The orders to eliminate her in the dream realm had most likely come from the King of Swords. But now, the very same king was proclaiming war on the pretense of punishing someone else for trying to assassinate her. Sunny glanced at Nephi's, wondering if she would show any reaction. And indeed she did. While everyone remained silent, either in agreement with the king or too wary of his power to raise a futile objection, she was the only one who spoke. Nephi's advocated against the war. Her voice was even, and her expression was poised. She calmly listed all the reasons why a war would be disastrous for both domains, and asked her adopted father to reconsider. Morgan seemed amused by the whole sequence of events, while the rest of those gathered in the hall kept their faces neutral. In the end, Neff's words were meaningless. Anvil dismissed her objection with one glance and a few cold sentences. Everyone here knew that there was no point in trying to defy the sovereign's will. Nephi's, of course, knew it best of all. The reason she had spoken out was not a sincere hope that the war could be avoided. Instead, it was important to do so for an entirely different reason. There had to be a record of her objecting to Anvil's decision. There had to be rumors that Changing Star of the Immortal Flame clan had been against the bloodshed, the waste of human life, and the ghastly ugliness of the civil war between humans from the very start, even if it was all to avenge her against those who had conspired to kill her. Those rumors were needed to pave a way for her to slay both her adopted father and Kai Song, and then usurp their thrones without being branded as a tyrant. When the time came, she had to be welcomed as a savior instead. Sunny smiled behind his mask. What a treacherous world we live in. Not long after that, the Sword Domain declared war on the Song Domain. The news was broadcasted in the waking world, as well as announced by heralds in the cities of the dream realm. Both worlds seemed to explode. Sunny was far away from civilization and too busy to observe the immediate reaction of the people, but it must have been intense. In an instant, the very foundation of the world was shaken. The government tried to handle the situation somehow, but it was powerless against the influence of the great clans. People in the waking world were terrified and paralyzed by shock, so were many in the dream realm. There were plenty of those who welcomed the news, though, having been prepared by meticulous propaganda to feel exactly that way. On both sides, many were burning with militant zeal and thirsting to punish the enemy. And so, two great armies were gathered and marched to war. It did not happen in a day, but it also did not take a lot of time. The preparations of the two sovereigns had been extensive. Today, finally, the Sword Army was ready to enter Godgrave. As Sunny watched the sky, there was the sound of light steps behind him. Then Nephi's approached and stopped by his side, clad in a suit of lustrous steel armor. She looked at him and smiled. Despite the sinister clouds above and the vast army marching to a calamitous war below, he couldn't help but feel his heart race at the sight of that smile. Sunny had read somewhere that people often described this feeling as having butterflies in their stomach. The image of a swarm of dark butterflies tearing at the walls of his stomach seemed more dreadful than romantic, so he really doubted the literary sense of those people. But still, even though a month had passed since their first kiss, he still felt excitement every time he saw her. It was odd and improper to feel so blessed on the eve of a disastrous war, but he did. Life was strange that way. A smile appeared on his face as well. "Do you have enough spare time to visit a humble enchanter today, Lady Nephi's?" She lingered for a moment, then shrugged. "I might have a little time." With that, she turned her head and looked at the sky as well. "Are you worried about the sun?" Sunny nodded slowly. I am indeed a little nervous. Do you think that the clouds will hold until we land? Nephi's inhaled deeply. Someone will make sure that they do. In fact, she should be arriving any moment now, actually. Sunny raised an eyebrow. Then a subtle spark ignited in his eyes. There was the sound of fluttering wings, and a vast shadow fell on the emerald grass. A moment later, a woman was standing in front of them. She was tall and slender, with long hair that fell down like a cascade of pale gold. Her posture was perfectly straight, and her cold face was dazzlingly beautiful. The woman was wearing a suit of light steel armor, with pauldrons and greaves decorated with stylized feathers. The gaze of her stern amber eyes was piercing and heavy, and a white cloak hung on her back, embroidered with silver thread. St. Tyrus had not changed at all. Sunny was glad to see her, of course. He hid his happiness behind a mask of respectful unfamiliarity. Skytide bowed slightly. Lady Changing Star. Nephi's nodded. St. Tyrus. The two weren't very close to each other, but they had a good relationship due to what had happened during the Battle of the Black Skull. In fact, there was probably no saint among the vassals of Clan Valor with a deeper bond to Nephi's than Skytide. Her clan was also different from how it used to be. Its status was still far from being favored by the king, but now that Roan had transcended, there were two saints among the members of the clan. There were few legacy families who could boast the same, so that alone made it impossible to ignore or oppress White Feather. Much more importantly, Skytide's status soared now that the war was imminent. Her power over winds and clouds made her one of the most valuable people in Godgrave, which was a sword that cut both ways. She was indispensable for the rulers of the sword domain, and therefore they were forced to treat her nicely now. On the other hand, she was one of the primary targets for the forces of the song domain, so Sunny was more than a little bit worried about her. Nephi's, meanwhile, nodded curtly in his direction. This is Master Sunless, an enchanter employed by the Fire Keepers. St. Tyrus looked at him expressionlessly, then frowned a little. Master Sunless, your name sounds familiar. Ah, had my daughter commissioned a memory from you? He bowed politely. Indeed, I had the privilege of fulfilling a request made by Awakened Tell once. Skytide's expression did not change, but he could swear that her eyes turned a little warmer. I see, that memory is serving my husband well. Your competence is worthy of praise, Master Sunless. With that, she seemed to forget about his existence and looked at Nephi's. The realm boundary is close. How long will it take the Ivory Island to reach the target area? Nephi's answered neutrally. Around an hour at top speed. Will you be able to hold out for that long if need be? Skytide glanced at the gray sky, lingered for a moment, then nodded. I will. I won't be able to assist with anything else, though. The immolating sky was not the only threat that waited for them in Godgrave. It was the most dire one, though, so everything else was beside the point. Nephi's gestured for St. Tyrus to follow her and headed for the ivory tower. We will handle the rest. Allow me to guide you. As they were walking away, she threw a poignant look at Sunny. He smiled and nodded subtly, telling her not to worry about him. As Master Sunless, he was not supposed to participate in any battles, so he could only observe today. It was a strange situation to be in, but he could not complain. There would be plenty of battles for him to fight before too long, anyway. Perhaps more than he could handle, even with his 7 bodies. Letting out a heavy sigh, Sunny turned to the edge of the island and looked down. At some point, the door of the marvelous mimic opened, and Aiko walked out, yawning as she looked around with sleepy eyes. Noticing him, the petite girl floated off the porch and flew around the cottage, eventually landing on the grass near the edge. She looked down and made a face. Damn boss, there are so many of them. so many potential clients. Sunny gave her a dark look. Cover your arms. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Aiko was wearing mundane clothes, and not even formal ones at that. Her black t-shirt had some kind of nightmare creature printed on it with a band name written above in bold letters, which wasn't really a problem, except for the fact that the intricate tattoo of a snake that coiled around her right arm was almost fully revealed. She grinned sheepishly and summoned a green memory tunic. Sunny hesitated, then said quietly, "Are you sure you don't want me to bring you away to the waking world?" Aiko looked up at him and blinked a few times. "And miss all the fun, miss such a historic event. No, thanks, plus I know these guys well. Don't worry, boss, they'll be fine, they have survived worse." He stared at her for a few moments, wondering if she would change her mind after witnessing Godgrave. In the end, he didn't say anything. Together, they watched as the shoulder of the colossal skeleton grew closer and closer. The ivory island accelerated, leaving the ascending army far behind. Soon, the sky was entirely hidden by a veil of clouds, and the air grew warmer, the daylight changing subtly. They were heading for the collarbone of the dead deity, where the base camp of the Sword Army was supposed to be established. And they, the Fire Keepers, were meant to be the vanguard of the human invasion into Godgrave. Their task was not only to clear out the nightmare creatures populating the area and serve as a bulwark that protected the slow advance of the army from the arm of the titanic skeleton. What they had to do was much more important. It was to bring the authority of the King of Swords and the power of his domain to this cursed land. Soon, the vast range of the ancient collarbone was beneath them. The ground was white, but there was barely any of it visible under the thick carpet of scarlet growth. Moss, grass, and grotesque towering plants were all red, as if bloody marrow had exploded from the cracks and fissures in the ancient bone. Of course, the vermilion jungle was teeming with all kinds of abominable creatures, all moving and devouring each other in a mad rush to live and grow in the unknown, but inevitably fleeting amount of time before the veil of cloud broke, and the merciless sun burned them all to ash. At such a late stage of infestation, the surface of the dead god's collarbone was not much safer than the dark expanse of the hollows, where the true horrors dwelled. The strange nightmare creatures populating Godgrave would have had enough time to grow immensely strong, reaching the corrupted or great rank en masse. The strongest would have already retreated underground, to try and claim a place for themselves away from the annihilating heavens, but many still remained. And now, all their undivided attention was turned to the beautiful island drifting below the clouds. Usually, these abominations would have felt nothing but fear when looking at the terrible sky. But today, perhaps for the first time in countless years, they felt something else. A hunger so deep that it drove them into a state of frenzy. Immediately, the scarlet jungle seemed to boil. Numerous abominations rushed in the direction of the descending island like a morbid tide. Most of them simply ran, slithered, or crawled, but there were those capable of soaring into the air as well. A vast swarm of nightmare creatures rose from the ground to meet the ivory island. It seemed inevitable that the flying citadel would be swallowed by the cloud of them. But then an imperceptible change spread through the world. Sunny's eyes narrowed when he recognized the familiar feeling. Another component of the ivory tower was unleashed, and suddenly, it was as if a wave of invisible force crashed into the rising abominations, throwing them down or outright obliterating their hideous bodies. Blood spilled from the sky like crimson rain. The tyrannical crushing had come to Godgrave, reaping countless lives in the first culling of the Great Domain War. The crushing descended upon Godgrave, flattening a vast swathe of the vermilion jungle and pressing the nightmare creatures into the white surface of the ancient bone. Its reach was a magnitude smaller than it had been in the ruins of the Kingdom of Hope, but its force was just as tyrannical. The winged abominations that had been rising toward the flying island were either obliterated or thrown to the ground. A deluge of blood rained down, and only the strongest and most resilient of the flying horrors managed to stay in the air. They persisted stubbornly, their eyes full of demented frenzy. There were terrifying aerial behemoths among them, and nimble creatures that zipped around on swift, translucent wings. A moment later, the first arrow streaked down, hitting one of the larger abominations in the eye and obliterating half of its hideous head. Sonny looked at the macabre spectacle, feeling his blood boil with a familiar thrill. He had never thought that he would grow accustomed to the ghastly crucible of battle one day, but here he was, acting as if he was addicted to it. He longed to join the bloodshed but could not allow himself to. It was the strangest thing. He could see the fire keepers, who were spread out along the edge of the island, drawing their bows. Some of them were better archers than others, but each and every one was proficient enough with the bow and arrow to be a lethal presence on the battlefield. Their memories were all top-notch as well, not only because they had gathered a vast arsenal of them during the long years of defending humanity from the horrors of the nightmare spell, but also because Sonny had personally tinkered with their equipment in the last month. On top of that, all these memories were being enhanced by the crown of dawn that Nephi's wore. A barrage of enchanted arrows unleashed by 7 ascended cohorts was a dire sight to behold. The winged nightmare creatures that had endured the crushing were simply erased from existence, chunks of flesh raining on the scarlet jungle below. Only one remained, an enormous beast with wings wide enough to drown the world in their shade. Its frenzied eyes were burning with chilling malice, and its pale brown hide was dotted with dozens of arrows, none of which managed to pierce it deep enough to deal substantial damage. The winds groaned as they were torn apart by its mighty wings. Before the monstrous creature could rise any higher, though, a single fiery arrow streaked down from the top of the ivory tower, piercing its head clean through. Wisps of white flame escaped from inside its cracked skull. The massive abomination lost momentum, rolled in the air, and started to fall down. The ivory island was plummeting from the overcast sky, descending lower and lower. The closer to the ground it got, the more the jungle was affected by the crushing. Many of the nightmare creatures that had been pressed down into the red moss were now flattened into piles of bloody flesh, sharp shards of bone protruding through the broken skin. Most were powerful enough to survive, though. Finally, the speed of the flying island's descent started to reduce. It was still great, nevertheless, almost uncontrollable, as if the people on the island were in a rush to reach the ground. And they were, because the sky above them was suffused with blinding glow, and only a thin veil of cloud stood between them and inescapable annihilation. Brace! When the shout spread among the firekeepers, Sonny gracefully lowered himself to one knee and put one hand on the grass. Echo simply floated into the air, hovering above the ground. In the next moment, the ivory island crashed heavily into the white surface of the ancient bone. The dead god's collarbone quaked, and a violent shockwave obliterated a vast stretch of the vermilion jungle in the vicinity of the impact zone. The 7 chains hanging from the ivory island rattled as they struck the ground. The lake resting on its surface rippled, spilling over its shores, and the chain breaker swayed on the tall waves. The ivory island came to rest, laying tilted on the white expanse of ancient bone. The crushing dissipated. Down below, countless nightmare creatures moved, rising from the ground. Their bloodshot eyes focused on the figures of the firekeepers looking at them from above. The cloud of debris raised into the air by the impact had not settled yet when they started to move, flowing toward the invading island from all sides. However, the firekeepers were moving too. The closest to Sonny was Seed, who had been Neff's driver on the day of the assassination attempt. Clad in a light armor and armed with a sword and shield, She stepped up to the edge and looked at the tide of abominations with a grin. Then, before the sparks of light swirling around her head manifested into a helmet, she raised her sword and kissed the flat of its blade. "Here we go." Letting out a battle cry, she jumped down, the plume of her helmet fluttering in the wind. All along the edge, those fire keepers who were proficient in melee were doing the same. Those who excelled in ranged combat, as well as those who usually played a supportive role, stayed above, continuing to send arrows and sorcerous attacks into the tide of nightmare creatures. Soon, the fastest of the abominations reached the vicinity of the island and clashed with the advancing fire keepers. Sharp steel hissed as it cut into flesh. More blood spilled on the sun-bleached surface of the ancient bone. Sonny observed the battle with burning eyes. The familiar cacophony assaulted his ears, and he felt his hands itching. Nevertheless, he remained where he was, playing the role of a non-combatant. Before the fire keepers could drown in the tide of nightmare creatures, a radiant figure shot from the balcony at the top of the ivory tower, falling down like an incandescent meteor. Nephis landed in the thick of the abominable horde, and in the next moment, a blinding explosion boomed above the bone plain. A wave of incinerating flame spread outward from the point of impact, turning countless nightmare creatures to ash. The fire keepers cheered, welcoming their personal deity to the battlefield. Looking from above, Sonny let out a long sigh. "Ah, to hell with it." Then he took control of the gloomy shadow and used Shadow Step to send that incarnation of his far away, under the canopy of the scarlet jungle. Assuming a corporeal form there, he manifested the onyx mantle and summoned Weaver's mask. Then, before any of the rushing nightmare creatures could lunge at him, he stepped through the shadows once again, appearing in the midst of the battlefield. An enormous, towering abomination was right in front of him, raising its terrifying fists to deliver a crushing blow to the ground below. Reaching into the shadows, Sonny pulled an inky black Odachi out of them and then lunged forward. A dark line was suddenly drawn on the massive body of the nightmare creature. It froze for a moment, its fists still raised above its head, and then slowly fell apart, bisected down the middle with a single terrifying slash. Behind the abomination, a slender young woman with silver hair was revealed, holding a mirror-like sword. There was an expression of surprise on her beautiful face. Grinning behind the mask, Sonny gave her a small bow and said, his cold voice hiding a hint of dark glee, "Welcome to Godgrave, Lady Nephis." With that, he looked around. "I hope you don't mind the mess. I think we are all going to die. What do you think, Ronnie?" Ray's voice was tinged with melancholy, but Rain had learned to ignore his complaints in the last few weeks. Sitting on the ground, on what served as ground in this godforsaken place, and leaning her back against a wagon's wheel, she gave him a relaxed shrug. The young man stared at her with indignation. After a while, he sighed. "Have enough decency to look concerned, at least." They were currently in the middle of the army camp, resting after a long and arduous march. It was hard to tell what time of day it was, since there were no nights in Godgrave. A veil of clouds obscured the sky, shining with diffused radiance. It would have been quite pretty if it was not so terrifying. Everyone had been informed over and over again about the lethal nature of the sky in this land. They knew that the only way to survive in case the clouds parted was to remain absolutely still. The army had ascended the dead god's arm far enough by now to fully cross the realm boundary. So, those warnings were of vital importance. They had yet to see the clouds break, though. Rain, Tamar, Ray, and Fleur were among the awakened warriors of the 7th Legion, which was led by the 7th and last daughter of the Queen to reach transcendence, Saint Satian. Granted, Rain barely remembered how she ended up in such august company. So many things had happened in the last month that it was all like a blur. The news about the King of Swords declaring war on the Song domain had reached them not long after reuniting with the members of the survey team in the main construction camp. It was a great shock to many, but not to Rain herself. The initial shock was soon replaced by fear and outrage. It was then that Queen Song left her palace in Ravenheart, appearing in public for the first time in many years. Rain did not witness it herself, but she was told that the Queen's speech was incredibly rousing. It ignited the hearts of the people of Song, so when the call to arms was issued, countless awakened warriors chose to answer. The vassals of the Queen responded to the call, as well, gathering their armies to help defend the Song domain against the tyranny of the King of Swords. Rain was one of those awakened warriors. She was made a soldier right there, and then, in the construction camp, as a member of Tamer of Sorrow's cohort. Tamer's father was leading his own war party, but he sent his daughter to serve under Song Sation, and her blood sisters. Rain wasn't entirely sure why, but she had no reason to complain. There were hundreds of thousands of awakened in the Song army, but only 7 royal legions. And although Saint Sation was the last among the 7 transcendent princesses to conquer the third nightmare, her personal power was in no way inferior to that of her sisters. So the 7th Legion was among the most elite forces in Godgrave, comparable to the Knights of Valor led by Morgan, the Princess of War. Rain was honestly unsure how she had ended up here. I guess that's the benefit of getting in through acquaintances. The weeks between the declaration of war and today were incredibly hectic. So many things had happened, and yet one of them stood out as more bizarre than any other. It happened immediately after Rain joined the Song army. She was woken up in the middle of the night by her teacher, who gestured for her to follow him quietly. Together, they left the busy camp and walked far into the wilderness, eventually reaching a secluded gorge. There, Rain had to stop and rub her eyes, bewildered by what she saw. Out there in the middle of the dream realm, a quaint brick cottage stood, illuminated by the pale light of the 3 moons. The sight was so strange that Rain assumed that she was seeing things. However, she was not. There was really a neat cottage standing in the desolate wasteland of the Moonriver Plain, a walking distance from the main camp of the road construction crew. It was not a mirage, and neither was it an ancient ruin. In fact, the brick building was neat and tidy, as if someone frequently swept its porch and washed its windows. Rain looked at her teacher with wide eyes. "What is that?" He answered matter-of-factly. "That is an ascended devil pretending to be a cottage. Come inside." She did not know what else to do but to follow him into the cottage. The door opened by itself and then closed behind him. The interior looked like a dining hall of a small cafe. There was no one inside, and no source of light except for the moonlight pouring through the windows. It was more than a little bit creepy. A moment later, the moonlight was extinguished, as well, leaving Rain in absolute darkness. Teacher." There was a scratching sound, and a small light appeared in the darkness. Her teacher was standing near a shelf, holding a burning candle in his hand. "Come." With that, he turned around and went back to the door. Rain had no idea why they had come inside only to leave with a candle, but she obediently followed. To her shock, however, the Moonriver Plain was gone. When they came out, there were no moons, no stars, and no wind. The floor was perfectly flat, as if cut from black marble. She couldn't quite see where they were, but it felt as if they were underground. And there was someone else there, as well. "God admit it's so creepy. Boss, you're back. Where the hell did you, who's that?" Rain had the same question. Out there in front of her, sitting on the black marble floor, was a little girl, who had a very dirty mouth and addressed her teacher as boss, for some reason. Rain raised a hand and pointed to the strange child. "Who's the brat?" The little girl floated up, lowered her feet to the floor, and stared at her with wide eyes. Brat, what do you mean, brat? I'm 28 years old. Rain blinked a couple of times. She had assumed that the petite girl was a child, but now that she looked closer. Ah, how embarrassing. Rain looked down. Oh, sorry, Auntie. The petite girl opened her mouth in shock. Auntie? No, wait, what do you mean by auntie? Listening to the two of them, her teacher let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. To answer your questions, this is awakened Rain. This is awakened Aiko. Aiko, Rain is my disciple. Rain, Aiko is my assistant. They turned to him almost simultaneously. You have an assistant. You have a disciple. Then they looked at each other, both wearing a similar shocked expression. Her teacher smiled. No need to sound so stunned, really. Sure, I do. Why wouldn't I? Now the reason I brought you two here is to extend an offer to you both. Consider it a great honor. His smile turned a little sinister, making both of them feel a bad premonition and shiver. His smile turned a little wider. How would you ladies like to join the Shadow Clan? And that was how Rain ended up with an intricate snake tattoo coiling around her arm. Leaning on the wheel of a supply wagon, she closed her eyes and listened to Ray's complaints silently. The snake tattoo, which was apparently called the Mark of Shadows, was more than a simple tattoo, of course. It was akin to an attribute, granting her several useful abilities. Among them was the ability to see in absolute darkness, walk stealthily in the shadows, and sense their movements. It also helped her control her soul essence. Apart from that, the snake could also slither off her arm, manifesting into a weapon. Most importantly of all, at least according to her teacher, it allowed him, as well as the creature that had created the soul snake, access to her soul sea, which meant that they could defend it should something invade Rain's soul. She had not even known that there were things out there that could invade human souls, but knowing that her teacher would be there to deal with the invader made her feel better. All in all, the soul snake was an excellent gift to receive. Of course, it was not the only thing she had received from her teacher. The Mark of Shadows played an important role. It protected Rain and gave her a few useful abilities, but its main purpose was to confuse people. After all, she did not want anyone to learn that she did not have an aspect, and the snake tattoo bestowed upon her strange powers that could be seen as one. Her teacher had mentioned that he was working on something else to make her disguise more convincing, as well. Rain did not know what he meant yet, but was going to learn one way or another in due time. What excited her the most was not the Mark of Shadows, though. It was the memories her teacher had given her. Oh, the joy and delight of having memories. Rain held a strong opinion that all the rest of the awakened in the world had no idea how good they had it. Her threadbare bodysuit and old clothes were gone, replaced by an enchanted armor. It was so soft and light that she did not feel any burden at all, but more resilient than her mundane equipment had ever been. The armor was made of dark gray fabric and lusterless black leather, fitting her perfectly. It was an awakened memory of the fifth tier. That was what she had been told, at least, called the puppeteer's shroud. Its enchantments increased her mental endurance and resistance against mind attack, as well as allowed her to recover from mental fatigue faster. The armor looked suspiciously similar to what her teacher used to wear, so she suspected that it had not been, in fact, crafted specifically for her. But even if the puppeteer's shroud was a hand-me-down, Rain did not mind. The euphoria of having a wonderful suit of incredibly light, but resilient armor that adjusted to fit her body perfectly, cleaned and repaired itself, and could be summoned at any moment was simply too great. It was the reward for slaying the awakened tyrant. There were two other memories that she had received from her teacher, as well. One was a powerful bow made of green metal. In fact, Rain knew that metal all too well. It seemed that her teacher had smelted the blade of the huntsman's axe to forge the limbs of the bow, while the string was made from some strange black material. The bow was called the Beast of Prey and was an awakened memory of the third tier. Its enchantment allowed Rain to enhance the damage dealt by her arrows, as well as infuse one arrow with devastating force at the cost of most of her essence. However, the bow was also able to absorb and store her essence, somehow. So, with sufficient preparation, Rain could use the deadly shot twice. She received the Beast of Prey in exchange for the memory coupon her teacher had given her for slaying the huntsman. The third memory she received, however, was a free bonus. It was a quiver of enchanted arrows that never seemed to run out. The arrows did not really possess any special qualities, apart from the fact that their flight was absolutely noiseless. They were also incredibly sharp and could pierce thick armor. All in all, Rain was quite happy with her little arsenal. Of course, it was only the beginning. She expected to receive many more memories in the future. Sadly, her teacher seemed determined to only award her memories that fit her kills. He could have given her something much more powerful, without a doubt, but then people would start asking questions about her identity. How could a newly awakened girl with no backing be walking around with a soul arsenal that put even the legacies to shame? That sort of thing. Get up, rest is over. Tamar's voice drew Rain from her pleasant thoughts. Opening her eyes, she sighed and rose to her feet. All around them, the Song army was stirring. After ascending the right arm of the dead deity, they were finally ready to delve into the jungle growing on its white surface, and then cross to the colossal skeleton's collarbone. This rest stop was the last one they would be able to enjoy in relative safety. The edge of the jungle was somewhere ahead, a few kilometers from the head of the column. The 7th Legion was marching closer to its tail, so Rain could not see anything. Nevertheless, everyone was tense. That was because everyone knew that they were heading into battle. Not that people like Rain and the members of her cohort could do anything in a battle like that. From what they had heard in the last few days, the jungle had been allowed to grow for long enough that most nightmare creatures populating its depths were of the corrupted rank. Awakened warriors were simply not powerful enough to face them. Today, the battle was only for the masters and the saints, and for the abominations enthralled by Beastmaster. Just as Rain thought about it, a messenger arrived from the head of the column and hurried past them. She turned around and watched him disappear into the command tent of the Legion. Soon, several blood sisters emerged from it. And then their leader. Rain couldn't help but hold her breath when she saw the Queen's daughter. Saint Sation was a striking woman without a doubt. With her strange but beautiful gray skin and tantalizing grace, she was like an embodiment of nobility and regal poise. She seemed both inhuman and riveting, but most of all mysterious. Her beauty was truly breathtaking. It was to the point that the Blood Sisters, each an exquisitely beautiful woman herself, seemed plain and unassuming next to her. Rain still found it weird that most of the most powerful warriors of the Song domain were women, but she couldn't complain. Especially here in the 7th Legion, she sometimes felt that she was in a flower garden instead of an army. Granted, those flowers were roses with bloodied thorns, and most of the rank-and-file soldiers were still men. Saint Sation led the ascended warriors of her legion toward the head of the column. The awakened warriors silently bowed as she passed, wishing her luck. Rain couldn't help but do the same. The Song army was bound to suffer casualties during the push to establish a fortified base on the collarbone of the dead deity. Looking at the powerful members of the Legion, she couldn't help but wish that all of them returned alive. At the same time, Rain couldn't help but wonder. Today, they were going to fight against nightmare creatures. What would she feel when the time finally comes for them to fight against people? The army assembled in a complicated battle formation. With so many soldiers, it was vast and unwieldy and mostly useless, but not entirely so. The Masters and the Saints were going to assault the Vermilion jungle, but the Awakened were prepared to fight as well. Obviously, they had very little chance of killing corrupted abominations, not to mention the great horrors who dwelled in Godgrave. However, they did not necessarily need to. The commanders of the Song army were well aware of the limitations facing their troops, so they had come up with various chilling but effective strategies. If it came to that, the task of the awakened soldiers was not to kill the powerful abominations, but to immobilize them. Although hard, that could be achieved with numbers alone. Even if an abomination had to be buried in human bodies, that was one way to deal with it. Of course, Rain felt a bit horrified by the prospect, just like all the other awakened warriors did. Still, it was not like the nightmare creatures would spare them otherwise, so they were prepared to carry out their orders and do their best, no matter the cost. Hopefully, that was not going to happen today. If the saints and their ascended retinue succeeded in holding back the tide of nightmare creatures, it would not. The 7th Legion was positioned in the second line of the formation, so she could not even see the battle. All she could see were the tops of the strange and hideous plants swaying in the distance and the backs of her fellow soldiers. She could also hear the sounds that the wind carried from somewhere far ahead. Next to her, Fleur trembled nervously and looked at Tamar. "It is starting, isn't it?" The legacy girl nodded somberly. "It is." A few moments later, the sound of a horn rolled above the army, and the ground under their feet trembled slightly. Rain saw vague silhouettes moving forward from the front of the battle formation. The white surface of the ancient bone was still inclined, since they had not reached the collarbone yet, so she could not discern their shape clearly. But she knew that they were the saints who had assumed their transcendent forms, as well as the larger of the nightmare creatures enthralled by Beastmaster. At the same time, the jungle came alive. She saw the red trees sway, but mostly she heard and felt it. A harrowing choir of bestial roars and sounds too alien to be described with human language washing over the massive army like a tide. The violent trembling of the ground as countless abominations rushed forward at the scent of human souls. She glanced at Tamar. For the rest of them, the fate of the saints fighting on the front line was an abstract concept. The saints were people whom they admired, looked up to, and maybe even knew, as well as the wall separating them from having to face the dreadful horde of nightmare creatures themselves. But it was different from Tamar, whose father was somewhere out there, as well. The Saint of Sorrow was among the warriors whose task it was to make the tide of abomination stop. There were close to 2,000 masters in the Song army, but only around 40 transcendent champions. It did not seem like a lot, but at the same time, the world suddenly quaked. The world suddenly seemed to be on the verge of shattering. The violence of 40 saints unleashing their transcendent power at the same time was staggering. Even far removed from the battlefield, Rain felt blood drain from her face. Next to her, Fleur swayed and leaned heavily on Ray. All around them, the awakened soldiers staggered. Only Tamar remained standing straight, seemingly undaunted. She did, however, look at the sky. As Rain's eyes widened, she did as well. Was the clash between the champions of the Song army and the creatures of the Vermilion jungle terrible enough to rip apart the veil of clouds? Luckily, it did not seem so. For now, the sounds of the battle grew much more loud, becoming almost deafening. Rain had to struggle not to raise her hands and cover her ears. To her shame, she found herself trembling. Insane, this is insane. The fear that had risen from some deep, primal part of her was almost too powerful to overcome. The inability to see what exactly was happening out there ahead only made it worse. After all, it was the unknown that was the most terrifying. All she could see were the backs of the awakened soldiers that stood in front of the 7th Legion in the formation. They were not faring any better than her. Some were shaking, some had fallen to their knees, some had dropped their weapons. There were those who did not, though. There were those who helped their comrades to stand up and supported them, gripping the hilts of their swords tightly. Rain wanted to be one of those brave souls as well. Assaulted by the terrible cacophony of battle, she looked down at her shadow. The sight of it instilled her with strength. Gritting her teeth, she raised a hand and patted Fleur on the shoulder. The delicate girl looked at her with frightened eyes. "Our Ronnie." Rain smiled. "Relax, what's the worst thing that can happen?" Fleur's beautiful blue eyes widened. "What? Why did you say it out loud?" Tamar and Ray glared at her with resentment, too. Rain grinned. She was still a bit of a stranger in this small cohort, so apart from Tamar, the other two members acted a little awkward around her. It was rare to see all three united in such a sincere display of emotion. And that emotion was pure outrage, not fear or anxiety, so her job here was done. Rain looked ahead and sighed. Although she might have overdone it. From what she could hear, the vanguard of the army had managed to stem the tide of the nightmare creatures. A furious battle was happening somewhere ahead. However, the saints had not managed to stop all abominations. Just then, she heard a litany of human cries and saw bodies flying into the air. It was as if something massive slammed into the front row of the awakened soldiers at the head of the battle formation. Human blood spilled on the white bone. The war horn blared one more time, and the soldiers ahead of her moved forward. Rain shivered and gripped her bow tighter. Far ahead, a strange haze rose above the crimson jungle. It seemed like a haze at first, but soon she saw that it was a vast swarm of flying abominations rushing from the depths of Godgrave like a cloud. "Gee gods!" One of the awakened soldiers near them pointed at the swarm in horror. Rain sighed and looked at the members of her cohort apologetically. Her grin grew a little forced. "Well, I guess that's the worst thing that could have happened." On the other side of the titanic skeleton, the ivory island was surrounded by a sea of nightmare creatures. The horde of them flowed forward, tearing the scarlet jungle apart. The jungle itself was moving too. Vermilion vines were crawling, and rust-red flowers were blooming, releasing clouds of flesh-eating pollen. It was as if the whole world had come alive to devour the invading humans. The humans, meanwhile, met the tide of abominations with sharp steel and the destructive power of their aspects. The firekeepers were skilled and formidable. Their discipline and morale were beyond reproach. Their cohesion and experience were unequaled. Countless nightmare creatures fell to their blades, torrents of blood being absorbed by the ancient bone. And yet they were being pushed back. A force of 50 battle-hardened masters was truly fearsome, but most of the abominations they faced were of a higher rank than them. These creatures were also the cursed spawn of Godgrave, where nightmares had to fight and devour each other without reprieve for the infinitely small chance to survive. The surface dwellers were not the true horrors who hunted in the dim twilight of the Great Hollows, but they were also exorbitantly fierce and ferocious, even when compared to the usual demented frenzy plaguing all nightmare creatures. The horde was vast as well. Granted, the fire-keepers had been forged and shaped by the Forgotten Shore, and so, facing abominations that were more powerful than them was more or less their speciality. But still, there was one reason why they were able to hold out. Two reasons, actually. One was Changing Star of the Immortal Flame Clan. The other was the Lord of Shadows. It had been a long time since Sunny was truly able to unleash himself. Right now, he was like a dark hurricane that moved across the battlefield, surrounded by a vast mantle of flowing shadows. He neglected to manifest any of his shells, using only his two hands and the black Odachi to cut the abominations down. Everywhere he went, severed bodies fell to the ground. Sunny was using shadow manifestation to control the surrounding area and shadow step to move around it, dancing between the nightmare creatures as his blade reaped their lives. While wielding serpent as a weapon, his essence was replenished with every life he took. The faster he killed the abominations, the more essence he received and could therefore burn, and the more essence he burned, the more enemies he could slay. Reaching a dangerous equilibrium in that manner, Sunny rampaged on the battlefield like the epicenter of a vast whirlpool of blood, darkness, and death. Of course, it was not easy. The corrupted nightmare creatures were falling easily to his blade, but he could be just as easily overwhelmed by them. All it took was a single mistake. But Sunny did not make any mistakes. Despite the startling speed at which he moved around the battlefield, despite the daunting complexity of navigating it with no regard to the familiar constraints of linear space, despite the burdensome task of maintaining both the lethal dance of slaying steel and the flowing storm of manifested shadows, Sunny's mind remained cold and clear, aware of every little detail of his surroundings and full of merciless killing intent. He did not allow the dire mayhem of the battle and the intoxicating stench of death to pull him into a state of battle frenzy. No matter how brutal and unbridled his slaughter seemed, it was instead a result of precise and callous calculation. There were no emotions in his heart, no distraction in his mind. There was only clarity and will. The will to see his enemies dead. Nephise was fighting on the other side of the Ivory Island. Sunny could not see her, but he could sense her presence through the movement of shadows. In the world of shadows, her presence was as vast as that of the sun. She had unleashed a sea of incandescent flames, turning a swathe of the battlefield into a searing inferno. The flames moved as if possessing a mind and hunger of their own, spreading through the horde of nightmare creatures like a plague. Where the power of the scorching flames was not enough, her sword fell like a herald of inescapable finality. At the same time, she was supporting the fire keepers. When one of them received a wound, it was healed by the soft radiance of her soul flame. When one of them was on the verge of being swallowed by the tide of abominations, she was there to lend them the power of her incandescent blade. Cassie was participating in the battle as well. Her unseen presence was subtle but played a pivotal role. She was not present on the battlefield, and no nightmare creature fell to her sword. However, she served as the connection between Sunny, Nephise, and the fire keepers. She was aware of all and guided them all, helping them fight as a single being. She could also share the traits of the abominations with them, making the task of surviving the dreadful onslaught much easier. It was because of her that Nephise knew when one of her people needed support. The fire keepers knew when to press forward and when to retreat. Sunny knew where the most dangerous enemies were and in which direction he had to move. Nephise was in command, but Cassie was the person who made sure that the commander had all the necessary information to make good decisions. Sunny had not seen the fire keepers fighting a battle of that scale before, and now that he did, he was quietly impressed. He knew many who were more powerful than them, and a few who were more skilled than them. But he struggled to think of another group of warriors who were capable of showcasing this level of cohesion, combat awareness, and effectiveness in a battle. That said, it was still not enough. It did not matter how skilled and brave the fire keepers were, or how unreasonably powerful he and Nephise had become. At the end of the day, they were still fighting against impossible odds. There were simply too many nightmare creatures, and each of these nightmare creatures was too powerful. Sending 50 masters and 3 saints to face an entire death zone was a suicidal task. They could not even retreat because they were surrounded from all sides. However, this time, Clan Valor had not sent Nephise into battle hoping that she would die. This time they desperately needed her to survive. For a while, at least, Sunny sensed it before he saw it. An invisible but undeniable change that spread across the battlefield. He was not affected himself, but the fire keepers certainly were. They did not grow stronger, and their swords did not become sharper. And yet suddenly, more nightmare creatures were falling to their blades. More blood was flowing to the ground, but less of it belonged to humans. Observing the inexplicable change through shadow sense, Sonny couldn't help but feel a deep sense of confusion. There was no reason for the sudden shift in the cadence of the battle, but it had shifted, without a doubt. Lacking any other explanation, he was tempted to think that it was a result of luck. But there was something deeper than that going on. He continued the wanton slaughter, defending one side of the ivory island. At the same time, he was standing on the grass of the island, near the marvelous mimic, observing the battle idly side by side with Aiko. It was that incarnation of his that tried to understand what was happening. Almost an entire minute passed before his eyes suddenly narrowed. Sonny exhaled slowly. I see. The firekeepers were not lucky. They had not grown stronger, and their weapons had not become sharper. It was just that they were fighting better. Their already impressive coordination had improved, reaching an almost inhuman level of perfection, and their battle sense seemed to have become even keener. It was as if they were possessed by a spirit of war and had received its blessing. He had seen something similar once before, albeit in a less pronounced way. It was during the Battle of the Black Skull. Back then, Morgan had armed her soldiers with enchanted swords forged by her father. Wielding those swords, the warriors of valor showed a strange level of cohesion, making it seem as if her entire army was one vast, lethal being. Back then, Sonny had guessed that the swords served as conduits for Anvil's authority, as vessels of his will, and therefore, of his domain. And now, his domain had spread to Godgrave. After all, that was the entire reason why the Ivory Island was so important to Valor's plan of subjugating this cursed land and winning the war. The entire war was, at its heart, a race to conquer local citadels and allow the sovereigns to express their power here. At the end of it all, the Supreme who controlled more citadels in Godgrave and could therefore manifest their domain in a more profound way, would have a great advantage in the battle against the enemy. The Queen of Worms was still powerless in this dreadful land, since there was nothing to summon her authority here. But Clan Valor had Nephi's and her flying citadel as well. That was why they had tolerated Sonny's defiant unwillingness to surrender the nameless temple to them, and that was why they were already winning. Because unlike Kai's song, Anvil could already express his power in Godgrave. And he was expressing it now. It had already spread in the vast area around the Ivory Island and rooted itself in the ancient bone, under the cloudy sky, empowering his subjects. That was why the Firekeepers were suddenly more effective in the fight against the nightmare creatures. And that was why the Sword Army would have far less trouble entering the Scarlet Jungle. The spot where the Ivory Island landed had been chosen carefully to make sure that the king's authority covered the army's approach. But that was not all. Sonny shivered, suddenly overwhelmed by a cold presence. Turning around, he looked up at the balcony of the ivory tower. And no way. There a tall figure in dark armor stood, a vermilion cloak fluttering in the wind. A crown made out of dull steel rested on his head. The King of Swords had arrived to Godgrave. Then the world was consumed by a scarlet storm. Countless sparks enveloped the Ivory Island and the sky above it, swirling like a hurricane of scarlet light. There were so many of them that it seemed as if the whole world was suddenly desaturated of all colors except for red. Then the sparks formed into a sea of rustling swords. An endless river of them blotted out the sky, moving in strange, hypnotic patterns. Mesmerized by the sight and drowning in their shadow, Sonny almost forgot about the figure of a man standing on the balcony of the ivory tower. The man did not move, but his cold gaze fell on the horde of nightmare creatures below. In the next moment, the storm cloud of swords exploded with a lethal hail. Countless swords rained down, making the bone plane shudder. Down below, Sunny's avatar lowered the black Odachi and froze. It was a terrifying feeling to see the steel sky fall on him, glistening with countless sharp tips. However, he did not have to feel fear. Although it seemed that the rain of swords would obliterate everything on the surface of the ancient bone, none of the falling blades struck him. Instead, they reaped a terrible harvest of lives, piercing every nightmare creature in sight. In just a few moments, the horde of them was eviscerated. Numerous abominations were violently impaled by the flying swords, while those that survived the first onslaught were either bloodied or petrified, slow to escape the inevitable doom. None of the fire-keepers had received even a scratch, though, despite the fact that many of them were now surrounded by a forest of swords. The swords did not stop moving. More of them rained from above, and those that were impaling the nightmare creatures tore free of the bleeding flesh, rising into the air and turning to point at new prey. Standing in the sea of blood, Sunny turned and looked at the distant balcony. He should have felt elated, because the battle was ostensibly over. But instead, all he felt was a cold feeling of unease. Sunny knew that, one day soon, he would be the target of these flying swords. "What's the matter? It's just a sovereign." For once, the words did not bring with them any levity. Lowering his gaze, he peered at the horizon. There, far away, the first of the vermilion banners appeared in the distance. The sword army had crossed over to the collarbone of the dead deity. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story, and if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.